Hello, everybody. Um, Welcome again to another session of the African Epistemologist Advanced Seminar Series. We welcome you all sincerely, wherever you are. African Epistemologist Advanced Seminar Series is one of the seminar series hosted by the Institute for Humanities in Africa. And my name is Sanya Osha, and I convene this particular series. And on behalf of the Director of Humor, Dr. Divine Fu, who is our director here, I welcome you also to this special event. We have a very important speaker who has done tremendously well in promoting African philosophy all over the world. He is Professor Marcos C. Lopez who is based in Brazil at the University of International Integration of Afro-Brazilian Lusophony, UNILAB, Brazil, and is currently working to forge stronger links between African philosophers and Brazilian philosophers. To this end, he has been conducting a series of interviews with African philosophers and philosophers of African descent all over the diaspora, which he hopes to publish as a book. So it's something to look forward to. I'm particularly happy to be part of the project along with other African philosophers. And he'll be speaking today on the panorama of African philosophy in Brazil, beginning with the law 10639 in 2003. Professor Lopez, thank you very much and welcome to this event. And he'll be translated by Alina Luz, Alina Luz, who will be translator. And so we hope you'll be able to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which there'll be a Q&A, question and answer segment at the end of it. And that will be towards the end of the session. Thank you so much, Professor Lopez. Please take the floor and we readily await your presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
I am grateful for Sanya Osha and for the invitation and the possibility to participate in this meeting. And I have some problems with English. I try to speak but my English is very poor. I have some video from YouTube. It's as I need for all see this video before my talk.
To be Black in Brazil, which is the second largest country by the number of Black people, it's a challenge.
Brazil imported more slaves from Africa than any other country.
More than 4 million African slaves were brought to Brazil between the 16th and the 19th centuries.
Brazil was one of the last countries in the world to abolish slavery in 1888.
There are several things that make our racism specific. No less brutal, no less cruel, but it's specific to the Brazilian context. One of the first things that we had is myth that the birth of the nation was composed of several races, and because of the diversity of people here, we would actually live in a racial democracy where everyone has a place in it. And because of this multiracial aspect of our society, we don't necessarily consider the ancestry of people in Brazil when defining their race.
A lot of people don't see themselves as Black, as part of a discriminated group, as part of the group that for almost 4 centuries were working as slaves here in Brazil.
Eu me descobri negra em 2015. Eu estava às vésperas de completar 27 anos, 26 para 27 anos. A nossa história, né, os livros não contam. Eu comecei a buscar por autoras tanto contemporâneas quanto autoras já mais antigas, né, Lélia Gonzalez, né.
Isso é uma prova patente, né, desse racismo não assumido existente na sociedade brasileira, né, do racismo que eu chamo de racismo por denegação.
It was harder to have a Black identity with all the whiteness around you and you had no positive reference of Blackness. It's not that those references didn't exist. They did, but they were erased. How could you want to be someone who's going to be erased?
The Black movement in Brazil started when Black people ran away from slavery. Quilombos were the first Black organizations in Brazil.
Over the years, thousands of slaves who escaped their masters established so-called Quilombo communities. The biggest and best known of them was the Quilombo dos Palmares, led by Zumbi dos Palmares.
There was a very specific dynamic during slavery, which was the establishment of a free Black population with personalities like André Rebouças, who fought to have their voices heard even before abolition. To silence this Black narrative was a very clear and powerful project.
There were no racially oriented policies in Brazil, such as the South Africa's apartheid or the Jim Crow laws in the United States. But even though we didn't have such policies, Brazil created a lot of obstacles that prevented Black people from accessing lands, the labor market, and education. For more than 100 years, people who didn't know how to read or write could not vote. And who were these people? Mostly Black people.
Meu avô, por parte de pai, chegou no Brasil no navio negreiro, ele tinha 5 anos. E a questão racial na minha família nunca foi muito discutida. Eu comecei a me descobrir negra quando eu fui para a faculdade. As experiências que eu tive antes com preconceito, com uma série de coisas, eu entendia como preconceito de classe. A minha identidade era da morena, eu era mulata.
Wanna live in Los Angeles? Well, good news. This is your chance.
In Brazil, the term pardo translates to brown or mixed race with African ancestry. It refers to the mix between Black and white people or Black and indigenous people. In the country's first census in 1872, brown people were among both the free and the enslaved population. It's important to highlight the fact that a part of them were also enslaved along with Black people. In the 1940 census, the immigration process played a big role.
They brought people from Europe to Brazil to work in the industrialization process. But these people also helped whitewash the society because people in power believed that there were a lot of Black people here and it was necessary to make the society whiter.
From the 1940s onwards, there was a solid growth of the brown population as a result of miscegenation, the racial mixing. The concept of racial democracy was developed in a way that highlights the idea of harmonious coexistence between races in Brazil. We are talking about the 1940s, when the world was experiencing World War II and Nazism. And Brazil had a mixed population with racial conflicts that were not disclosed as in countries such as the USA and South Africa.
As in most countries of South America, the color of one's skin does not always determine one's social standing. As a matter of fact, the racial color line seems to be so thinly drawn here that it has become a haven of toleration for all races.
After the war, Brazil became a laboratory for the world when a UNESCO project decided to analyze racial relations in the country. And that's when our supposed racial democracy is debunked. Those studies put a spotlight on the existence of discrimination based on race in Brazil.
Isto que é designado por aí como democracia racial tem sido, através da história, apenas a sistemática exclusão do africano e seus descendentes de todos os níveis de poder e de decisão neste país.
Several black movements, such as Frente Negra and later on the Unified Black Movement, managed to take to the streets even during dictatorship because of their willingness to denounce the myth of racial democracy, which was one of the bases of dictatorship in Brazil. In the beginning of democracy after 1985, there were also big protests in Brazil.
To choose Zumbi dos Palmares as the symbol of freedom was very important for us Black people, because the history taught in schools was that Princess Isabel was the one responsible for making Black people free.
We managed to get a lot of improvements out of these mobilizations. First of all, we managed to include racism as a crime in the 1988 Constitution.
Viva a raça negra do nosso país!
As well as to include the protection of quilombolas, who are former slave descendants. Later on, under Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Lula, and Dilma administrations, we managed to have several policies in favor of Black people, especially during Lula's term. The Secretariat for Racial Equality was established. Several universities established affirmative actions based on race. Self-identification, looking at oneself and thinking about whether you're a Black person or not, is very much a political act. It's a way to understand the context, your ancestry, and to see your place in history and the way people look at you. So, those policies that targeted specifically race, not only class, not only gender, but also race as one of the key components of hierarchies in Brazil, they made a lot of people recognize the role of race in their own lives.
Between 2000 and 2010, the Black population grew at a higher rate than the total population. We cannot oversimplify the understanding of this process, but part of this growth involved a change in self-identification. Many studies show that brown and Black populations have pretty similar socioeconomic characteristics, which widely differ from those of white people. The Black movement considered it politically important not to separate those two groups, otherwise we can't properly elaborate policies to address racial inequalities in the country.
We start in Brazil, where a teenager has died after he was smothered and suffocated. The incident has incited widespread outrage and spurs comparison to the Eric Garner police killing.
This is the woman whose killing has provoked such outrage, Marielle Franco. The 38-year-old councillor has become a voice for gay and Black rights, as well as fighting against police violence in poor areas of the city.
The attack was the latest blow in what they see as an undeclared war against poor, mostly Black people living in favelas. At least 50 shots hit the car where the youth were traveling.
Agatha was killed by a police bullet last September. She was 8.
Racism is at the very core of police brutality and the ideology that allows it to happen. On a daily basis, we see that Black people are subject to a much larger level of police violence than white people. 75% of people killed by the police last year in Brazil were Black, in a population where 56% of people are Black.
Now, under Bolsonaro administration, we are facing several challenges. Bolsonaro used this slogan, "My color is Brazil," as a way to reinforce this idea of racial democracy. He says the Black movements are creating racism when they talk about racism.
No Brasil é coisa rara, o racismo. Tenta o tempo todo jogar negro contra branco.
The Black Coalition for Rights, a new movement that connects several Black groups in Brazil, was established after the election of Bolsonaro. They recently released a manifesto saying that with racism, there is no democracy. Nowadays, Black people are looking at their ancestry with pride. There is a movement connected with the idea of understanding your racial background and looking into references related to your ancestor, such as the candomblé, the banda, also the way you use your hair, your clothes.
Era ter certo trauma de infância, né? Porque eu sempre fui obrigado
a cortar o cabelo mensalmente ou 2 vezes no mês, né? Então eu só fui descobrir como era o meu cabelo de verdade com 18 anos.
It's very exciting and important to see that people are very much involved in the fight against racism, especially young people. I mean, the bad things that are happening in politics and economics and the pandemics, there is a conscious cry for power that is led by Black people in Brazil, and I think that's a very important thing to recognize as well.
Are you sharing a PowerPoint or okay?
Yes, you can share, Marcus.
Okay. I need sharing a PowerPoint, but
Yes, you can share, Marcus. You just need to.
Okay, I share here.
Yeah. Thank you, Marcus.
Moment. Okay. I think it is have partial, but I try. Let's go.
Great. Yeah.
Brazil has its body in America and its soul in Africa. It's a phrase of Antônio Vieira, Jesuit priest in 1691. I think I can thinking about Brazil can the beginning of the Pan-Africanism. Your main enemies in Brazil are the insurrect Guinea blacks who hole up in some sierras when they come down to hide and cause much trouble. And there can be the time when they assault and destroy the plantation, as their relatives do in the islands of São Tomé. In this description made in Bahia in 1596, priest Pedro Rodrigues, an experienced servant of colonizing project in Angola, warned the Portuguese crown about the possibility that the great uprising of slaves that occurred on the island of São Tomé in 1595 could spread and spur new uprising in America. In Pedro Rodrigues' evaluation, the kinship created by the structure of slavery generated an inevitable racial war against the insurgents, a conflict that is common feature of the colonial system in Brazil and Africa. It's the first time we see the description of the Aldenegros has as relatives because the structure of slavery. Brazil was formed from the South Atlantic in its commercial relations based on the slave trade with Africa. Paul Gilroy talk about the Atlantic black, but don't talk about South Atlantic. No American country practices slavery on such large scale as Brazil. On the total of about 11 million Africans deported and arrived alive in the Americas, 44%, close to 5 million, come to Brazilian territory over the period of 3 centuries. I think many of this information you see in the video. I go to the last, to another. My emphasis is in the conflicts of the war racial in the Brazilian story. Telling Black story in Brazil, you have two views. João Rufino dos Santos schematizes two models for telling Black history in Brazil. One, acceptance of slavery. Two, marginalization in the post-slavery period. And three, the search for integration. Or one, rebellion. Two, marginalization. And three, organized struggle against racism. Both models are reductionist and ideological, but they are useful to think about how the history of the Quilombos and Black resistance struggles were for a long time excluded for the official history. The description shows that racial conflicts and the struggle for the maintenance of the slavery order are marked the constitute the formation of Brazil since the 16th century. Thus, it is not possible to think of this country without considering the violence of the indigenous extermination process and the race war that remains implicit in persistent structures of social inequality. The process of abolition of slavery was not complemented by any political public policy of inclusion of slaves. Marginalization was complemented by the process of immigration of Europeans in a public policy of whitening the Brazilian population. Miscegenation should lead to a continuous process of whitening and elimination of blacks. The valorization of miscegenation as a national project was articulated with the denial of the existence of racism and racial discrimination in Brazil. Since there was no formal segregation as in the USA, the Brazilian model of racial democracy was even extolled by Leopoldo Senghor as a way of life suitable for building the civilization of the universal. Another aspect important is the racial classification in Brazil. Because the country has a long history of miscegenation, color lines in Brazil have long been blurred. The same people are black in one state or white in another state. You have the variation of classification of the same family in black or white or something. Brazil is the second largest Black population in the world. 96.7 millions. Black people, brown and black, were the majority of the Brazilian population. In 2040, representing 53.6% of the population. Brazilians who declared themselves white were 40.5 in the and 7% of the people living in extreme poverty in Brazil are black, and the average salary of the black population in this country is 2.4 times lower than that of whites. Furthermore, 80 of illiterate Brazilians are black and 2019. Blacks, addiction of blacks and brown people account for 77 of the victims of homicides. Abdias Nascimento talked about the genocide of of the Negro population of Brazil in 70 years. I try to show that definition of situado philosophy made for the Afro-American context by Cornel West is usual for Brazilian think his story and his philosophy. You put the word Brazil or Africa in the place of Afro-American and think Brazilian philosophy is the interpretation of Brazilian history, highlight the cultural heritage and political struggles, which provides desirable norms that should regulate response to particular challenges presently confronting Brazilians. If you think in this way, is Brazilian philosophy part of African philosophy? If you look for all the history and the majority of population, Blacks, you don't separate Brazilian philosophy for African philosophy. But I have problems, more problems. Differently for the double conscience, which is a presupposed element in the articulations of African-American philosophy and the other diasporic traditions, in Brazil, those who intend to think about African philosophy need to deal with part of a recognized tradition of debates and philosophical production, nor do we have racial identity as an explicit given, as in the United States, present by the denial of racism, the myth of democracy, racial democracy. That happens as Brazilians deny it exists, having taught racism as produced privileges for rights from all social classes. That's mechanisms encompass a broad picture of rationalization that runs from effective reverse racism to democratic attitudes that deny the racial issue, mechanically diluting it in the class struggle. This way, one can see how certain left-wing positions are doing nothing more than producing the myth of democracy created by the paternalist. When people talk about race in Brazil, the people who say about racism is accused to made racism. If you have victim, you try explain about it, and the people say, no, it don't exist. Brazil is not a racist country. I have when I look for Brazilian philosophy tradition, you have the same situation of other peripheral countries. Everything is construction and is already ruined. The situation of the formation of philosophy in Brazil is itself problematic for not having constituted a tradition of free and continuous debate. For this same reason, new beginnings tend to not to be interested either in previous efforts or in other voice that could generate tension. The characteristic of extroversion, the Paulinho Rotundillian contest. Philosophy in Brazil is European philosophy to Europeans and North American philosophy. An example is the history of Sueli Carneiro. In 18th, tried to propose at the University of São Paulo a master project in philosophy about African philosophy, studying the work of Paulinho Rotundi. The answer was that there was no one qualified to guide her and that they did not know about oral traditions. Paulinho Rotundi and oral traditions. The advice was to look for the Center for African Studies. She tried to carry out her project on a critical reading of contemporary African philosophy at the Center for African Philosophy Studies, and later at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo. Only in Carneiro finished this thesis in PhD in education, and looking for the mechanism of exclusion, of the systematic exclusion and subjugation, extermination and hierarchization of knowledge and of Blacks, the racial mechanism of power to exclude another voice. She talks about epistemicide. Connected to the problem of racial identity, the blur of racial identity is another problem. A study of African philosophy in Brazil is the need to deal with the question of racial identity. In a country with index of extreme and persistent inequality, the question of racial identity is a presupposition for breaking with the official narrative, which has become part of common sense. That is Brazil, where there would be no racism, or that its manifestations would be cordial and overcome by affection as expressed in miscegenation. In this sense, the confusion between a nominalistic and ontological approach to racial identity was creating a fuzzy notion of place of speech that has become the right to have or not to have a voice, restricting the possibilities of debate in a horizon where authenticity, insertion in religions and cultural practices, and colorism can be not only a block to continuation of the dialogue, but also a trap to be activated before any word that causes divergence or frustration. The panorama I will present of African philosophy in Brazil is undeniable reductionist, but for this very reason, it can be useful. I will not develop a distinction between African philosophy in Brazil and Afro-Brazilian philosophy, because that very boundaries and continuities are a matter of dispute and creative tension. The various approaches should be seen as continuities, not as divergence. The development of studies on African philosophy in Brazil in the period after the law 639,
639.
Okay, was primarily driven by the pedagogical articulation of the legal demands of teaching African and Afro-Brazilian culture and history in elementary and high schools. That's proposed for pedagogical articulation were mostly developed outside the philosophy departments. In education departments or anthropologic departments. If this, on the one hand, is another demonstration of the resistance of philosophical academia in recognize African philosophy as a valid and important tradition of debate. On the other hand, it also demonstrate how philosophy in Brazil is decontextualized, colonized, and having ancestralities is the first current or chain. The philosophy of ancestrality, not ancestry, ancestralidade in Portuguese, operating in 2003, fitting perfectly into the demands of the law as a rescue of the African cosmovision philosophy, moving away from homogenizing perspectives of the capital, of language, of bank, of representation. It counterposes the African cosmovision to the universalistic claims of the West. The philosophy of ancestrality is a discourse on Brazilian reality, recognizing its diversity and interpreting it based on the African cosmovision in Brazil, which has been neither philosophically nor historically exclusive. The philosophy of ancestrality is based on the experience of the collective subjects of the production of knowledge, of capoeira, candomblé, the quilombos, etc., as technologies of inclusion of the Black community. The ancestor cult is taken as a common and central element of the African worldview. The view of ancestrality is expanded to include indigenous people who are also part of continuum configuration of candomblé. This expansion resonates with the change in the law in 2008 that include the obligation of teaching indigenous history and culture in elementary and high school. The call for reconnection with the ancestor is a way of reconstructing subjective destroyed by racism, and a way of rescuing and highlight the value of Afro-Indigenous worldviews as opposed to Western universalism. Another current is Afro perspectives. What we call Afro perspectivist philosophy have three elements: Afrocentrism for Molefe Assange, American perspectivism by Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, and the quilombismo of Abdias Nascimento. The three elements are mixed in the Afro-perspectivism. Renato Nogueira seeks to articulate the positions of Afrocentrism with Abdias quilombismo, also included the Amerindian perspectivism from Viveiros de Castro, which postulates the existence of a common human culture and multiple natures. Together with these elements are added the pluriversality proposed by Mogobe Ramose. Renato Nogueira has developed research on the difference between the place of childhood in the West and in African perspective. Comparing, for example, the narratives and conception of childhood in Pinocchio and Kirikou. Renato Nogueira has a children's writer and developed this about the concept of femininity and love in the multicultural perspectives. Afrocentrism presented in ancient Egypt came as a source of thought on restoration. One of the most interesting approaches in this sense is by Catiúcia Ribeiro, who seeks to synthesize the knowledge of chematic thought which approach to sacred feminine, such as from the Matripotência of Oyeron Kioeumi. Another perspective of philosophy of education is pedagogias. Pedagogia that seeks the context, the teaching and evaluation methodologies, the way to research, the way to behave in the quilombo, including physical food with Afro-referenced conception. Many women working in quilombos propose a pedagogical practice and theoretical method, the Africanist cosmovisions to use in quilombo. The other three perspectives I show corporal practice, with the connection with ancestrality, or with connection of the cosmovision African, the African cosmovision. The other side I show is the political side of the African philosophy in Brazil. In this place, the Quilombo is the soul of the Black Brazilian population. As a practice of solidarity and community building, resurface in various artistic, religious, and political forms. The idea of quilombismo, which takes this place of a coexistence of diversity in opposition to colonialistic values and the conciliatory discourse of racial democracy, has gained strength in artistic representations, such as in the recent film Bacurau. Quilombo is the center of the soul of the Brazilian Black population. It's very interesting at this point. When I talk about the Brazilian who believes, who talk about herself, I'm a negro, I have a Quilombo inside me. I have a resistance inside me. Dias Nascimento proposed with Quilombismo the utopia of a formal political and economic organization that would have as its historical reference the experience of the Quilombos, moving away from capitalism and socialism. He dialogues with the Ujamaa model, but proposed a type of radical equality project. His proposal, launched in the same year of Molefe Assante's ideas of Afrocentrics, has many convergences with the North American movement, but does not distance itself from the partisan and reformist political struggle. Dias Nascimento has a political career and have made a large numbers of projects of the Quilombismo. The Quilombismo have many projects of transformation of the society. Many are utopians, but many are proposals, practical proposals made by the Dias. Another side of the Quilombismo is that the people of the Quilombo who says, I'm not Quilombist, I'm a Quilombo liver, né? Quilombola farmer and thinker Antônio Bispo dos Santos, ou as Nego Belwi, poet, writer, teacher, political activist, and Quilombola social movement activist. He is one of the main critics of Afro-descendants are treated in Brazil in objectified, criminalized, and animalized way. In the Quilombo is taken as a way of life. Nego Bispo then placed himself as the monoculture of Western talk and proposing his own vocabulary word of an author is to be dominated. So he proposed to tame the academics as he would any animal. However, as he points out, for his words are worthless if there is no change in nature, in consumption, etc. For Nego Bispo, you have a conciliatory or melhoristic way. All the people decide what cosmovision are West capitalist, the Quilombist, or African worldview. Another side of the African philosophy in Brazil is the side of faith in the party. We have rhythms of resistance, rev sounds, rev communities of the resistance. The name Kizomba is a word for Kibundo on the language organization, congregation, resistance. Kizomba also means People's Party, having its name originate in the dance of the black people who resist slavery, a call to fight the cultural resistance of a people. Metil Nagel, a philosopher who studies African philosophy, talk about Ludwig Kizomba, is the same direction of thinker. It's an eloquent example about this. The samba schools in Rio de Janeiro begin in 13 years to gain support from the federal government, which wanted to use samba as an element of national construction. As a result, the parades and deaths from the history of Oficial Brazil, which hide the forms of Black resistance and exalted white heroism in national building. Also, as part of this project of building a nationality. However, the drums of several samba schools kept in the beats the reference to the orixás that governate the schools and its community, its terreiros. In the other words, we have here a manifestation of Exu with many faces. On the one hand, the parade was part of project of appropriation and dissemination of the drums that beat the parade were of resistance and self-affirmation of Black African culture. Just as this history of samba points out, African practices in the diaspora are always about rebuilding community. Muniz Sodré talk about this rebuilding of community, of the rhythms of resistance, pointing to the sublime, non-discursive we find in ritualistic practices of candomblé, of samba, of capoeira. I don't read this, is very large. Another important philosopher in this perspective of the African philosophy is Tigana Santana. Tigana Santana wrote a degree in philosophy from the Federal University of Bahia, a PhD from the graduate program in translation studies at the University of São Paulo, which research of the Bantu Congo proverbial sentence based on the work of Congolese thinker Bunkezi Fukiao. For Tigana, African philosophy must be told in African languages. In his work as a musician, Tigana has authorial compositions in African languages. The historian Luiz Antônio Simas follows in the footsteps of Joel Rufino dos Santos, who told that beyond the organized Black movement, there is the Black in movement, which manifests itself in various cultural practices such as samba, Afro-Brazilian religions, soccer, etc. The attempt to think based on these cultural practices led Simas, Luiz Rufino, a pedagogue, and Rafael Haddock Lobo, a philosopher, to propose a Brazilian popular philosophy that seeks to express the wisdom of the streets of Rio de Janeiro, position itself in the conflict between two models of a country, the European and Western monotheistic and colonized on hand, and the Afro-Indigenous and on that affirms plurality by building other ways of life. I have to. more speed. We have another important voices in Afro-Brazilian or African philosophy in Brazil. We have Basilele Absoidade of Tialenga Ntumba, but in Brazil he's don't made the same direction. He forgot the analytical approach and Catholic approach of Ntumba and take the direction of polytheistic views of Candomblé and have to try to synthesize Ubuntu, Bissoite, Mate, and in Afrocentric Pan-Africanistic perspective. We have another voice on Brazilian philosophy who have the characteristic of take care of the difference between African Brazilian philosophy and African philosophy, to take advantage to seek in African philosophy on the existence of African philosophy, ethnophilosophy, sagacity. I cite some names in this direction. Wanderson Flor Nascimento is an exception to the general rule of the people working with the African philosophy in Brazil. As he is a professor in the philosophy department on the University of Brasilia. He tries to articulate Bidima's paradigm of the crossing with the Mogobe Ramose proposal of relational ontology baseado of Ubuntu. He have a great site with many texts of Brazilian philosophy, diasporica African philosophy, and separate African philosophical texts about the continent. Adbenia Machado is in the ancestrality way, but she talk about the different chains of African philosophy and the great debate, and think about the position of ancestrality in this debate. Luis Thiago Freire Dantas is the defending in 2018 the second doctoral thesis done in a philosophy department. He looked for the African philosophy as a key to decolonize the philosophy itself. We have debating issues of gender and sexual identity. This debate appears in the approach to African philosophy in works such of those of a philosopher Catarina Rea, who has sought to study queer in African thought. Many women are resgated to this debate. Many authors are forgotten and now stay in the center of the debates about African philosophy in Brazil. I try show two of these women. One is Lélia Gonzalez, a philosopher, anthropologist, a professor, a writer, intellectual, and Beatriz Nascimento, historian, activist, and the philosopher now. We have many things to investigate. For example, Muniz Sodré and Marco Aurélio Luz are two authors who have been thinking about. Helena Teodoro defended his doctoral thesis in Brazil in philosophy in '84, dealing with the African civilizational contribution to the construction of Brazil. Masters Juana Elbian dos Santos and Mestre Didi. The task of building a genealogy of these dialogues remains to be done. And on another side, Mestre Didi is an intellectual organic, a great master of the candomblé, and the connection of this ancestrality, academic ancestrality, heavy building is necessary to make a narrative about this. The history of historical figures that have not yet been properly recognized is a necessary test for the construction of an African philosophy in Brazil. Names such as Luiz Gama, Machado de Assis, Maria Firmina dos Reis, Lima Barreto, and Carolina Maria de Jesus have their works reassembled and taken up again in the current debates. Other authors, such as Lélia Gonzalez, Beto Nascimento, need to be recontextualized in a possible canon of African philosophy in Brazil. Neuza Santos, Milton Santos, André Rebouça, Joel Rufino, Abdias do Nascimento, Lélia Gonzalez, Guerreiro Ramos, and Sueli Carneiro. We have to make a narrative about African philosophy, a great narrative. We don't have this narrative now. I talk a little about Unilab, my university. The University of International Integration for Afro-Brazilian Lusophony is a public federal university focused on integration between African Lusophony countries and Brazil. For this place, and for this, the classroom is a crossroads of many knowledge and the reinterpretation of the knowledge. Many of the images of the Brazilians have of Africa in a vision that stems from their local culture, practice, gain histories and concreteness with the effective dialogue with students from Lusophone African countries. In the sense, working with African philosophy at Unilab, I developed with students a research and an extension project based on as a Black cultural practice that connects perfectly Angola state. I know I have the same religion of you. What religion? Candomblé. But the African says, I don't know Candomblé, I don't know about Capoeira, I don't know about the Quilombos. It's a very hard problem because the Brazilians think that Africa stay in his practice, but the Africans have another practice, another voice, another feelings. The work with hip hop is a form to think the African identities in a pluralistic way and broken the image of the Brazilians about Africa. I point some difficulties, some problems to dialogue about African philosophy and Lusophone countries. We have the doctoral. You have a PhD school in Mozambique. We have the many philosophers in Mozambique, but in general, we have we don't have a tradition and philosophical dialogue in Portuguese. For another side, we have different presuppositions different in Brazil and Africa. When we look for African Brazilian philosophy, we stay we look for the peoples who stay in the cooperation with Afro-Brazilian forms of religiosity. In the context of philosophy in Africa, the training of people who dedicate themselves to African philosophy departments from seminars like to Catholic Church. In the context of PALOP countries, questions around national building projects, Mozambicanity, Angolanity, have a privileged place, while in the context of African Portuguese-speaking countries, that's the question of the projects of national building has a privileged place. While in Brazil, it's necessary to destroy the discourse of Brazilians founded on the myth of racial democracy and build another narrative that recreates an we. Remarks of conclusion, I put these words of Molefe Sanche about the Brazilian situation. African Brazilians have hardly expressed the quilombismo in a Pan-African manner. This is the limiting aspect of the voice of African Brazilians. Brazil, your most important population center in the Americas, is best placed to help lead this struggle. I look forward to a more assertive Afrocentric Brazil, where the agency of African people seems as necessary to restore truth, righteousness, and justice. Closing remarks. November is the month of racial conscience in Brazil. In this period, some people are invited to talk about African philosophy, publish about racial issues, and think about these themes in Brazil. This festive custom is a welcome novelty, but it is still far from signifying recognition of African philosophy and racial issues as relevant to democracy. Bahia is a state that is proud to be the center of Afro-Brazil, almost 18% Black, and its capital, Salvador, is called the Black Home. Philosophy professors from the Federal University of Bahia have recently organized a book entitled Why Philosophy Matters in Democracy. The book, nominated for major awards, is very welcome. In it, there is no taste of racial issues, African or American philosophies. This is just one example that mirrors the self-image of philosophy in Brazil. Perhaps they don't know why democracy matters to philosophy. The need for change in the self-image of philosophy in Brazil says a lot about the political horizons of the country. If the Brazil of diversity is in confrontation with patriarchal and African philosophies cannot happen only in November. It's necessary to multiply disciplines, create jobs, and help the debates so that they increase their density in the game of asking and giving reasons, doing justice to the quality, potency, and creativity of the forms of resistance and solidarity of the depravity of this land. Thank you. It's the end.
Thank you so much, Marcos, for that very rich panorama. It wasn't just very broad, but very rich. I didn't know we had so many concepts in Afro-Brazilian philosophy. Thanks for drawing our attention to important concepts like quilombismo, ancestrality, and then the great names or the very exciting names of Afro-Brazilian philosophy. You mentioned there are three Nascimentos, Nogueira, and the others, so many others you mentioned doing important work, and the Angolan philosopher, sorry, the Congolese philosopher who is now doing important work, and so many. From your presentation, in fact, when you were talking about divergences, I see more continuities, you know, the developing concepts related to Ubuntu and so many other concepts like that, Afrocentricity and the like. Thank you. I didn't know that we would be treated to such a feast of concepts, of ideas and discourse. And I want to thank you for such a rich presentation once again. I'll now open the floor to our participants. I think we can take a few questions, even though we are over time, but we can't let this, must do some justice to this wonderful presentation. So I'll open the floor for questions, comments from the participants. Thank you.
Ele disse, né, tanto que a apresentação foi muito interessante, muito rica, que pôde trazer alguns conceitos importantes, né, como quilombismo, entre outros, e que agora vai abrir, né, para perguntas dos participantes que quiserem colaborar, mas reforçou da importância dessa fala que surpreendeu na riqueza das informações trazidas.
Enquanto a gente espera as perguntas, eu vou usar a minha tradutora. Eu vou fazer um comentário e pedir para você traduzir, Aline, só uma coisinha.
Pode falar, que eu traduzo.
Eu acho que existe uma continuidade também, porque existe uma África em comum imaginada pela diáspora. Uma África que tem um elemento sublime e não discursivo.
Tá, então vai devagar, fala de novo. Marcus said that it's a continuum with African philosophy. It's about the diasporic. Repeat, please, Marcus. Yeah. Marcos, fala novamente.
We have some connection of how the approach of African philosophy in Brazil is the ideal of the one Africa who giving a cosmological unity, a cosmological vision, and many people think about Africa have one cosmological unity. This image of Africa is very important, but we think is Africa stay in this practice, capoeira, candomblé, and another practice when he lives the Africa in this practice. It's not an imaginary Africa. It's a practice Africa. It's a Africa in common in the terreiros, when you have people of the many sides of Slavs, and the people stay together and found a new religion and a new rituals and a new vision.
Dominic, would you like to pose your question verbally, please?
Dominic isn't here. I'll just type the question. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. I'd ask. Yes. We have a question which was typed in the chat box. It says, "What are the differences and similarities between Afro-Brazilian philosophy and Brazilian anthropology? Afro-Brazilian anthropology." And then how does the concept of ancestrality link the two? Or, you know, I think there is some difference, at least some similarities in the two disciplines. And so this, the question is, what are the similarities and the differences between the two? Afro-Brazilian philosophy and Afro-Brazilian anthropology.
Pedindo as diferenças e semelhanças na filosofia afro-brasileira, na filosofia e na antropologia afro-brasileira. E se elas se comunicam, né?
Eu vou falar.
A partir das questões sobre ancestralidade. Tranquilo?
Eu vou falar bem devagar para ver se vai dar certo. Alguns antropólogos estudaram Fábio Leite. Você vai traduzir agora?
Você prefere falar tudo? Eu vou anotando depois eu repito. Ou você vai falando parando e eu traduzindo?
Eu vou falando parando e você vai traduzindo, porque eu posso pensar e você pode esquecer.
Tá, eu ia anotando aqui. Tá. Então, alguns antropólogos estudaram a Fábio Leite. Você falou que falhou a internet na hora?
I try speaking English now, então.
Não. Alguns antropólogos, repete essa frase.
Não? Alguns antropólogos brasileiros estudaram a África diretamente.
Some of Brazilian anthropology study Africa directly.
E o principal deles é o Fábio Leite,
the most important of
que tratou da questão,
that talks about the question,
porque ele tratou da questão ancestral. Ancestry. Mas o Fábio Leite disse que os resultados que ele tinha chegado não poderiam ser aplicados no Brasil.
But this anthropologist, Fábio Leite, said that the results that he alcançed can't be used to study Brazil.
Ele percebeu que o culto dos ancestrais era um fator comum em vários povos africanos. E esse culto dos ancestrais tinha duas formas.
He knows that the ancestrality rituals was common in many of the African cultures, but o finalzinho mais é comum em vários culturas.
Mas eles tinham duas formas.
And they will be organized in two ways.
Uma histórica e outra ahistórica.
One historical and another unhistorical.
Quando você olha para os antepassados mais próximos ou mais distantes.
When you look to your ancestral next to you and the more distant to your history.
Numa direção, você produz com o culto dos ancestrais hierarquia.
In one direction, it produce with ancestrality kind of hierarchy.
quando você pensa no Brasil, a ancestralidade é desconectada das formas de hierarquia que existem em África.
In Brazil, the forms of hierarchy existing in Africa is disconnected when we talk about ancestrality.
A ancestralidade no Brasil é uma forma de reconstrução de identidade.
The ancestry in Brazil is a kind of reconstruction of identity.
Enquanto em África, muitas
Enquanto na África, o quê? Repete, né?
A ancestralidade é uma forma de divisão de poder.
Enquanto...
Muito...
In Africa, ancestrality, while is a construction of hierarchy.
Is it done?
Power division. Okay.
Thank you so much, Michael.
We have. Okay.
Thank you so much.
I think it's important this question because ancestrality, I think in Brazil, in a way, very different for your identity and made a new identity. You think in the difference of blacks and browns. When we look for the percentage of the Brazilians negros, we sum blacks and browns. When we talk about ancestrality, you connect all in the same direction. It's a political usage of is a very useful tool in this political approach.
Okay, thank you. This is more than we can chew. I must assure you. You're doing us like a fiesta of ideas. So thank you so much. We thank Aline too for helping out. Aline, did a great job, and we have a lot to think about, I assure you. And we are very happy and honored that you were able to grace this occasion and present such a delightful presentation. So on behalf of HUMA, the director, Dr. Divine Fo, and the rest of the fellows based at HUMA, I'd like to thank you and then conclude the session. We look forward to seeing you again at other sessions, and have a great day and evening wherever you are. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so for all the people.